This program is designed to provide general information with regards to the subject matters covered. This information is given with the understanding that neither the hosts, guests, sponsors, or station are engaged in rendering any specific and personal, medical, financial, legal, counseling, professional service, or any advice. You should seek the services of competent professionals before applying or trying any suggested ideas.
Good morning, true seekers and true crime junkies. Welcome back to another episode of Hit the Road Jack, Finding the Zodiac with Nanette Bartow. I am looking at the alphabet today in reference to making an identification on the handwriting. Of course, we've already matched that handwriting from the Zodiac case to Jack Tarrance, but here we are now looking at all the different crime scene notes that I have actually examined over the years and putting them together because they are all involved in some sort of an unsolved serial killing spree. Last week, we ended with the P's, which I felt like I'd kind of rushed through. So I am going to actually take a step back this week and thoroughly go over that letter P once again. I'm going to go ahead and go full screen at this point so that you guys can see this nice and large. The letter P in this particular presentation is both lowercase and uppercase P's, which I did not explain last week. So I'm going to show you the differences between those and then at least go a little more thorough over what I found in the other communications. To begin with, everybody, if you've just now caught on or just now watching for the first time, I'm going to give you some ear markers here. These red and blue stars actually indicate communications that were actually written by the Zodiac Killer. These have been long since attributed to the Zodiac and identified as the Zodiac's handwriting by former document examiners of the Department of Justice and the FBI. So with that, we know that we can take for granted that all of these different constructions of the letter P's are what we might see, maybe even in other communications, as we're going to talk about. The blue insignias like these circles and the slants are all related to Jack Tarrance. So that means if you see anything below Jack Tarrance's name, which JW up here in 1945 to 2005, if you see anything below that line of P's, these are all the communications from serial killing sprees that are unsolved. Now, if you see a blue circle around one of those P's, that means that there is a correlation to a P in Jack's actual handwriting. So for instance, this particular P here in Elizabeth Short has this double stem, which is slightly a loop, but angular and pointed at the bottom. That is something that I actually found in Jack's handwriting. We can see it up here. Again, the double stem, angular point at the bottom rather than being rounded like a loop. Again, over here to the right, we can see it once again, double stem and point at the bottom. Now, if it is circled in red, then that means that it has been found within another communication of a crime spree. So as you cross-reference and you look at, say, the particular form and style of this particular P that has the bowl of the P that actually hooks back and crosses over the actual stem to the left, we've seen that in several communications, such as Tom Voigt's communications. We've seen it in the Oakland County child murder communications. I would have thought this would have been one that we would have seen a lot less because it is a natural source of Jack's handwriting. As we can see up here, he does this continually with his own handwriting. We can see here where that bowl of the P actually crosses back over the top of the stem to the left there as it enters from the left. So, and as you go through, you can see several different P's throughout that actually have that crossing point. The red arrows now point out specific identifiers or characteristics about the handwriting. As such, this arrow here to the left of Jack's P actually shows a hook at the beginning stroke of the P of the bowl at the top of the round. And of course, it is quite a bit distance to the left of the actual stem, as we were just discussing. Now, the one on the top here actually is pointing to this nice big gap between the stem and the bowl of the P. So technically speaking, this stem should actually run all the way up to the top of this bowl and plant itself so that it is a complete and full stem of the P. But we do see this nice gap that occurs here. We can see it right here in this P of Jack's. We can also see a gap here. There's a gap in this P and several other P's as you go down the line. So the bottom one, this bottom arrow right here, and this bottom arrow, and obviously this one. So 3 in, we have shown where the end of the bowl actually crosses over the stem to the left of the stem, and we can see the placement at which that is actually crossing, which leaves just a little tiny bit of the stems protruding above that exit stroke. So when I looked at the other P's that we just talked about that we found in those connections, we find that the exit stroke, albeit it is slanted downward instead of coming straight out, but it is just a small little portion that crosses over the stem in the lipstick killing case. And we do see that gap between the stem and the upper portion of the bowl. And that runs true with the Oakland County child murders. We see here that curvature at the beginning of the stroke of the P, of the bowl of the P, as we discussed in Jack's. We also see that nice big gap between the stem and the bowl itself, where it should have actually closed up the backside right there. And then we also see that that exit stroke happens at approximately the same level as it does in Jack's handwriting, leaving a tiny bit of the stem sticking up right there. Now, when I got down into Tom Voight's, we also saw the exact same setup. We see the top of the bowl that is actually started far to the left of the stem as it swoops around and curves under and exits. It crosses the stem itself. We see the nice big gap above the actual stem of the P, and we see that cross point again where the bowl of the P is crossing with the stem of the P is exactly what we see in Jack's handwriting. So again, we see just another great relation to Tom Voight's handwriting, which was identified as Jack Tarrance's handwriting by his biological son. Going further into Jack's P's, we actually see angular P's that are pointed upward. So we have this pointed instead of rounded bowl of the P, again, still crossing over to the left here, and a small gap right there between the stem and the top portion. Now, the bowl of the P actually slants quite a bit upward in this particular P, and I have actually mapped out all of these slants from one to the next. And this one right here on the red P, you can see this blue line that goes through. It shows the angle in which that actual bowl is sloping upward. And I've copied and pasted that to other P's down the line just to show that there are similar slants that are occurring. So let's see where we finished that one off at. Maybe I didn't lay that one down. That's okay. You will see that upward movement of the slant of the bowl as we go through. I also marked the slant of the actual stem of the P and the angle in which it leans, because it does tend to have a rightward lean. In fact, he also has a very hard rightward lean, as we'll see, that occurs in the communications, which is similar between one communication and the next. So keeping on with that, we do have some well-structured P's that look a little more copybook. They do tend to still have that rightward slant that we just discussed. And then we have what I refer to, and now, of course, the capital P's run from this first P under Jack's name all the way to this one that is in brown. Now, this is a lowercase p. So everything up to that point is a capital P, and we'll be comparing those to capital P's. This particular P was pointed out because it's what I refer to as the short stem P, where the bowl of the actual P is larger, more than half the size of the actual stem itself, leaving just a little tiny tail of the stem out the bottom of the P. And we're going to see that as well. It is the least obviously used, although we do see several of the P's that have short stems throughout Jack's writing. He does tend to use that structure. And then in the lowercase p's, we actually see what I refer to as the long stem P. So it's quite the opposite. In what we would expect to be the smaller of the P's, we would expect the shorter stem, but in Jack's world, he actually uses a longer stem. And how I note that is based on the size of the actual bowl of the P right there. How many times can I fit that bowl into this stem that is protruding from the bottom? And by the looks of it, I could do probably about 2.5 of these bowls if I were to map them out down the P stem itself. So that makes it quite a long P stem. Going over, we notated these angular ones that have this angle on the top portion of the P, which we can see a little bit better right here in this P. We also have the P that we talked about already with the double stem and the pointed loop at the bottom. And then, of course, the more angular P's that we will be talking about throughout the handwriting. And we can see more of them right here. It's basically looking more like a triangle than it is a circle. And to continue on down, we can see that he does employ the same kind of structure in his lowercase p's that he does in his uppercase, and that's where the stem does not reach all the way to the top of the bowl. And we do see that the entrance stroke is drawn from the left side of where the stem will plant as it comes around and touches back. We also talked about last week this particular curvature in the stem right here that kind of curves off to the left. And in doing so, it kind of makes this little wave off the backside of the P, which is very consistent. And I also noted that when he does his double stroke stem P's, that he tends to leave a little flag out the top. So he starts well above where the bowl of the P is going to be. And you see this protruding stem at the top here. Now, getting down into the lipstick killing case, we did make a match, as we'd already discussed, with this one with the other P's that cross over through the stem to the left-hand side, very consistent. We do see the P's that have that high raised or inclined bowl that is more angular. Both of these P's actually share that, as we discussed over here in Jack's. Now, Elizabeth Short did show the use of the P that we talked about where the bowl protrudes to the left of the stem, and we see that that is consistent with what we saw in the lipstick killing case. And then we got into some more what I refer to as that more copybook or more perfect attempt at the piece, making the letter P. And we can see that we are also finding what I refer to as those short stem P's, where the bowl is actually bigger than the stem itself. And as I go through on Elizabeth Short, there were several that were in there. We did find in Elizabeth Short also the P with the double stroke, where the loop of the tail of the P is actually angular. And we were able to find that actually in several places. I found it in the Dear Draft Board letter, and the Dear Draft Board letter also has that uptick or that stem that sticks above the top of the bowl, as we discussed in Jack's handwriting. So now we have at least two characteristics with inside this letter P on the Dear Draft Board note that is consistent with one of Jack's P's. We did also note that in the Dear Draft Board letter, we had this overinflated balloon style P, which is something that we saw in Sherry Jo Bates. I thought that was rather interesting since they were so close in the time frame, and that Sherry Jo Bates has been attributed to the Zodiac Killer by many, many people, including law enforcement at one point in time. So while they might be trying to bifurcate those cases today, literally back in the day, they had done everything they could, even meeting with multiple jurisdictions to determine that, yes, Sherry Jo Bates was likely killed by the Zodiac Killer. And since we saw that the Zodiac Killer took credit for Riverside activity, one would assume that, yes, he was responsible for Sherry Jo Bates as well. So this overinflated balloon P is consistent between Dear Draft Board letter in 1968 and the Sherry Jo Bates letter in 1966. Also in the Dear Draft Board letters, we see the angular P bowl that we were talking about in Jack's handwriting, and we see how it is pushed upward in, or it actually inclines upward, just as we were discussing back over in the lipstick killing case. I did skip over, it looks like a couple. The Sorry Mary letter, it actually had more of the short stem P's that we were talking about from Jack's handwriting, and some of these are just pretty much identical in shape and form, size and everything else with what we saw in Jack's. The Kern Werewolf Killer. Now, I'm not quite sure why it is that I circled that one, but maybe because it is a short. Okay, short stem P's are all being circled throughout. So we do see some that actually have quite a good length on them in here, but then we did see this P that popped up from the Kern letter where the stem was definitely smaller. The protruding stem at the bottom of the P was smaller than the actual bowl section of the P. In the Oswald letter, I found one capital letter P, and of course that P is similar in shape to what we're seeing. I should have marked that one up here. We see in Jack's right here is very consistent with the letter P in Oswald. And then we saw what I referred to as the long stem P with the tiny little bowls. And that, of course, is similar as we were discussing earlier about Jack's. Back over to the Zodiac Killer, we're going to see several of these habits that I've discussed or talked about, including this particular P here was actually found up in Jack's handwriting as well. We see that form and that shape, the stem not quite making it all the way to the top, but there is a tiny little gap in there, and we do see the swing back of the top of that bowl to the left of the stem. As we go further in, we find the angular or the pointed bowl stems that we talked about. We also see the short piece stem, and then we see for the first time in the Zodiac this curvature in the stem that actually goes back towards the left, and it creates, like I said, that little flare on the outside there. Going further in, we continue to see more of the similar shapes and styles of P's that we have from Jack. Again, there's that one with the curvature to the left, making that little tiny open point or triangular section off the back of the P that is consistent with Jack. And then we see more of these more angular or triangle-shaped P's as we go through. That continues on through many of the Zodiac writings. We can see that happening over and over again. Slant is definitely consistent within these letter P's, as we see with pretty much all of the ones that we've talked about so far. The slant of the rightward P or rightward moving P's are similar to Jack's in the Elizabeth Short writing, in the Sorry Mary letter, in the Oswald letter, in the Sherry Joe Bates. Zodiac Killer. It looks like Dear Draft Board was a little more upright, but we do know that Jack has the ability to write straight up and down. It's the more rightward ones, especially the severe right ones, like we see right here with this angular P bowl, and the way that it actually slants to the right is much more severe, as you can tell when compared to this blue slant that I mapped out for Jack up here. Some would allude to the fact that that letter falling over is literally the individual or the author falling over, and that could be attributed to a manic state or to drug use, because they're literally falling over and their lines are crossing, their brain is crossing, things are happening there. See, the Fairfield letters showed the same style of P as we found already up here in the Zodiac letters, which is consistent with the fact that they have found these letters to be from the same author. We do find P's that are similar to Jack's. And of course, the actual style and shape of some of these are consistent with the Oswald letter. The DC Freeway Phantom actually has the double stroke stem as well that moves itself down into a point. Of course, it is not open or viewably open, but we can tell that they end obviously in a point at the bottom. So there is no roundedness there and there's no openness to that P. However, the slants are consistent, and I did find other structures within other crime communications that were similar to these. Let me see if I can point some of those out. Well, for instance, over here in the Atlanta, Georgia, we find that this P is very similar to the P's we found in the Fairfield letter. These particular P's here were consistent with, let's see who we found those. Oh, goodness. Well, we know that the stem is protruding, so we do have a double stem because we can see that little high point that sticks out from the top of the bowl that is consistent. We found that that was consistent with a Jack P, which would be, oh, I think that is the angular notion at the top that we were seeing up here in this particular bowl, which is found in several of the letter P's throughout. DB Cooper, we do find again that secondary stem. Now, this P in DB Cooper is very similar to the Citizen P, where the stem is separated slightly from, or the second stroke of the stem is slightly separated and protruding. We see other P's that are definitely similar with Jack's that we've already discussed. We see the short stem P again, and we see this rather curved P that we were talking about down in Atlanta, Georgia. And I did map that one out in a couple. Oh, John Benet Ramsey. I think, yes, I believe I saw that also in the Scorpion. We have the long stem P, which we talked about. Now, this is well, actually the second, because we saw it in the Oswald letter, but in the DB Cooper, we saw what was consistent with the Dear Marco letter from the Zodiac, which is that long drawn out stem stroke of the letter P. And of course, again, that stem is at least twice as long as the bowl itself. We also found that the slant was consistent with Jack's slant, and we found that the P shape in itself was also consistent with Jack. In the Albany, that's the one we were looking for. So the 1973 Albany letter, I actually found that the letter P's were consistent with the letter P's in the Atlanta, Georgia. So that would tell me that this thought of disguise that we're seeing is very consistent with the stem that is sticking upward, the P bowl that is not connected back to the stem at the bottom. So that disguise is actually running throughout the crime scene notes, which would indicate that this person's attempt to disguise his writing was used in more than one note. The slant in the SLA is similar. Now, of course, we see in the Citizen letter, once again, that very, very steep rightward slant of the letter P, which is consistent with what we saw back in the Zodiac writing, which again confirms what they've already found, that these P's were written by the same person who wrote the Zodiac Killer P's. Now, of course, we're seeing that double stem. We're seeing the protruding top that we've already talked about in Jack's handwriting. Moving over into the Channel 9 newsletter, again, we find that very angular P, which was found in the Zodiac's handwriting. So again, confirms that Channel 9 letter was written by the Zodiac. And we see more of those small P's with the angular bowls, and the slant is definitely consistent. Here are some more with some angles. We did find this uptick stroke, and I believe we saw this on the letter I's and the letter L in this particular handwriting examination. So it doesn't surprise me to see it on another stem stroke in other places. In the Red Phantom letter, we did see again the long stem P that we talked about that occurred over in the DB Cooper case. We also found the short stem P's and more long stem P's. And of course, their shapes are consistent with what we see happening in Jack's writing. Moving on to the Oakland County Child Killer, we already talked or discussed this particular letter P, which was a capital P, and now we see the lowercase letter P's. And what I'm getting from this, obviously, with a far leftward slant to a rightward slant, is that the person is, again, attempting to manipulate their slant, thinking that's going to prevent detection of the author. Herb Cain had a nice rightward slant that is consistent with Jack's, and we can see that the long stem P's, once again, with the tiny little bowl, is consistent. The Herb Cain, same thing there. We've got, again, long stem P's with the shapes consistent with Jack. Atlanta, Georgia also had short stem P's as well. The Sacramento letter was more consistent, I believe, with it was in 1986, but the 1991 Scorpion letters to John Walsh had consistent P's between those. And I found that all of those P's in reality were consistent with John Benet Ramsey and the Voinovich letter in 2001. Now, I didn't have a lot to comment on in the Anthrax, other than we do see one short stem P. This one arguably could be also a short stem P. I wish I had better versions of these letters because they just tend to pixelate as I bring them up, but we can definitely see that those stems are approximately the same size as the width of the bowl, or even shorter. Obviously, this bowl is much larger than the stem that is left at the bottom there. One of the things that I skipped over up here in DB Cooper was the backwards writing of letters. And this was one of the P's in one of the communications that was written backwards by DB Cooper, which we know was a ploy of the Zodiac Killer. He absolutely wrote some of his letters backwards in the ciphers and stuff like that. And then in the Grimes case, which is why I brought that up, we see that there's again a P that is written backwards. And we also find that one of the P's on that 2x4, that piece of wood, is a short stem P once again, where the bowl is larger than the actual stem itself. Tom Voigt, we see these style P's throughout the handwriting in these communications. It is also a match to Jack. We also have the ones with the curvature in the stem right there that that curves backwards to the left as it moves upward. Many of the references that I've already made where the stem does not come up to the top of the P, as we see up here in Jack's writing, are very similar. The Tim Miller letter, I found lots of short stem P's, as this one is indicated here. Very, very short stem. We do find at least one P that has a rightward slant. And we can take a look at the Tim Miller P's and see that the author was attempting to try and make them as perfect without any of his idiosyncrasies that he has in his own handwriting, except for in this place here where we did find the double stem P, where the stem is separated from the bowl and does protrude out to the left there a little bit. And that again leads us right back to some of Jack's, and it looks like the Citizen letter. In the Bruce Ivans P's, we found very small bowls on the P's, very long stems, but one thing that stuck out to me was the severely rightward slanted P that we found in the Scorpion letters, in the Citizen letter, in the Zodiac Killer's letter. So again, there's a cross reference there to the severe slant that we're seeing in those letters, which this should then finally conclude the letter P for us. The letter Q was one of my favorites. Just from the get, I could not say enough about this particular letter, because everything from shape, form, construction, size, relation, everything in this particular letter was consistent between the Zodiac and Jack Tarrance. Now, I have pulled out, there's not a lot of cues for us to look at. Interestingly enough, it's just not a highly used letter of the alphabet in writing, but I did find it a lot in Jack's writing, and I did find it in Tom Voigt's, in the DB Cooper writing, and in the Zodiac Killer. Albeit the Zodiac Killer's capital Q was very much attempt at a copybook Q, which is almost completely perfect. So again, there isn't really any signs of habits that are in there. But when we moved into the DB Cooper, I wasn't shocked, let's say, that I was finding some habits. So we find this buckling that's happening right here on this left-hand side, where it looks like these starting and stopping points of this particular Q is happening over here to the left. And I point that out because that's exactly where Jack starts. I mean, basically at that, I'm going to call it about that 10, 11 o'clock hour right there. We see that buckling that's occurring on the left side of the top of the Q. And that's consistent with all of his letter Qs, with the exception of this last one here. Now, keep in mind that these two right here are just a copy of each other, so that I could point out different facts without blocking the view of the actual letter. Same with Tom Voigt. This is all one letter Q that I have reproduced 3 times in order to make those same claims. Now, one of the things that I wanted to show was this very long exit stroke of the cross of the bottom of that comes out of the bottom of the Q. And of course, we have just a tiny bit that's on the inside of the Q, and we have a very elongated portion that sticks out from the bottom of that Q. It happens in a couple of Jacks, but that is consistent with what we're seeing in Tom Voigt's Q. Also, I found that the slant of the bar of that actual Q in at least 2 of Jack's slants were consistent with the slant and the directional flow of the actual crossbar in the Zodiac Killer. And then when I got into the Q that actually is a teardrop shape, which we talked about that in the letter O's. So obviously making a Q is quite like making an O. So we see this Q or teardrop type form, and we see that occurring in Tom Voigt's. Now, when I laid the crossbar slant down over that particular crossbar on the Q, it actually lines up with the crossbar within, I would say, a millimeter or so within the slant of Tom Voigt's. Also noting that that teardrop shape obviously allowed for an angularity in the Q instead of being completely rounded. And we can see the way those slants work themselves out across that letter Q and how that is similar with what's going on with Tom Voigt's. Now, even more of a telltale, this was my favorite, obviously, in the Zodiac, was the lowercase q. And that is because every time I found a lowercase q with the Zodiac Killer, with the exception of this one right here, I found that it looked more like a number 8. So we have the bowl shape here, and then he moves back down around, and he moves counterclockwise with the tail of the actual Q, and he wraps back up around almost as if making a figure 8. And that's exactly what I found in Jack's handwriting. So that to me was probably one of the biggest identifiers of this case. Another one of those smoking guns, if you will, because the letter Q obviously is definitely one of those letters that can be created in so many different ways, and I've seen them created in so many different ways. However, I've never seen this particular construction in handwriting in over 15 years. So for it to be something I have not seen in over 15 years in any case that I've handled is kind of a tribute to how specifically identifying it is, or individualistic it is, for an individual to have written it like this. And of course, we see a couple different types here. We have these ones that have the flattened bowls, and then we have ones that have these rounded bowls. And of course, we can see that there is definitely the rounded bowl section that's occurring. And Jack also has that flattened bowl that we were just talking about. Of course, this is just a bit different of a tail than we were seeing. However, I'm not finding that that is much of a difference, because really all he did was stop short when he wrapped that tail back around. Had he brought that all the way up to the top of the bowl of the Q, we would have seen something more like these figure 8s that we're finding here. Looking at the actual shape of the bowl of the particular Q that is not a figure 8, I find that that is definitely consistent with Jack's shape and size and the flatness of it and the open portion up here at the top where it does not close back together. Now, the only difference is, and now the slant is definitely very similar with that tail slanting to the left, we see that the tail on this one actually, when it came back up, it stopped short and crossed over very low, not actually leaving a loop or an openness. But I did find that at the point that it crossed was very similar to the level at which these Qs by Jack were actually crossed. Now, I did find, let's see that. Oh, go back. Ugh. Okay, so that is Jack's letter Q over the top of the finale letter Q. Channel 9Q actually, instead of bringing that bottom portion of the Q back, he went to the right. But again, Channel 9 News is definitely related to the Zodiac and written by the same author. So I do find that that is obviously a consistency with the shape of the actual bowl is consistent with the shape of the bowl of the finale letter, which is also similar to the shape of the bowl in Jack's. Now in Kern, they wrote it basically just straight with a straight tail, which kind of looks like a letter P if you flipped it around, but that is the letter Q from Kern. And we found that the finale letter also used a straight stem. And then in that backwards letter P in Cooper, we see that we have another similarity, at least in the ratio of the bowl of the actual P and how much of that stem is left hanging over in the Kern letter. JBR, JonBenet Ramsey, and the OCCK case, both of them had letter Qs, and both of them had the figure 8 style. Once again, we can see there with the JonBenet Ramsey. So again, that's probably another one of the reasons, aside from Jack's letter M, I found it very, very convincing and compelling that this letter Q in the JonBenet Ramsey note was also done in this figure 8 fashion, where it all touches back and looks like a number 8. The OCCK, I found that the shape of the bottom of the actual loop is actually considerably consistent while it's a little bit wider. We do see the angularity at the bottom portion of the tail. And then we actually see, as you move back up to the right, that there's another angular section right here, just halfway up that stem as it moves itself backwards and into the actual bowl. And we see that angularity that's occurring both here in Jack's and also in the Zodiac's before it makes that turn back. The letter R. Now, the letter R has there were so many consistencies with the letter R's in these communications, and some of them may be something like this bowl of the top of the R that is actually hunched over the buckle, and the buckle is the point where the bowl actually comes back to the stem and then exits itself out into the right leg of the R. So it looks like he's kind of melted and falling over sideways onto its own leg, and that's something that I consistently found in many of the crime scene notes. Let's see if we can find one right here in DB Cooper. We can see where that particular bowl has melted itself back over the top of the leg. Right here in the Oakland County child murder, once again, we can see where that bowl has again melted itself rightward over on top. We see it in Voinovich. We see it in right here in Tom Voigt. Now, it's not as severe as some of the other ones that we see, but we can see how it almost looks like the R is beginning to fold itself in half. So we have this hunched over or leaned rightward bowl that is actually leaning down on top of that leg. Let's see if we can find that in some other places here. Yep, right here in the DB Cooper, once again, which we already just talked about over to the right in DB Cooper, but we can see again where that bowl has melted itself down over the top of that leg. Further, we do have a buckle that has a loop in it in Jack's writing. We can see it in a couple different places. I did find at least one in Atlanta, Georgia that had that loop. It is not something that is, it's a little more rare in Jack's handwriting, which might explain why I only found it one time in all of the communications, but it was worth at least noting. I also noted the slant of the actual legs of the R, where the left leg tends to be a little bit higher and the right leg a little bit lower, and we see that happening a couple times. But then we also see this upward trend where the left leg is lower and the right leg is higher. Either way, he's not bringing those legs completely back down to the baseline evenly, and we were able to show that in many of the letter R's as we go through them. So he does have the construction in the capital letter R where he does the straight stem stroke, and then the second stroke actually includes not only the bull, but the buckle and the actual right leg of the letter R. As we get further into him, we start to see a single stroke construction where he does not pick the pen up and execute a secondary stroke, but we do see that secondary stem stroke that is protruding or sticking up to the left-hand side here in that letter R, so we'll keep an eye out for that. Further on down the line, I found these ones that had almost this umbrella or arcade style leg. So some of these actually are concaved as he exits out for that right leg, and then some are arcaded, and we see that occurring. But one of the things I pointed out was this particular, I call it the droopy leg. So instead of actually exiting with some type of a slant to the right where it moves rightward, it actually moves straight down after it comes off of the actual bowl of the P. And again, here's one of those melted bowls again that we were talking about, but we can see how this leg here in this R also goes straight down as it comes off of the letter R. At the top, we find that protruding secondary stem again, and I only brought in the letter D to show how far back that Jack would actually make these overhangs to the left of the stem of any particular capital letter, because in the Sherry Jo Bates letter, we had this very, very huge overhang on the letter R, and we also had, oh, I guess I should have notated that, we have a loop in the buckle there, and we have an arcade on the right leg, so there are some consistencies. Now, making our way into the Lipstick Killer case, we did have a buckle as well in that one, and we have in some cases, 3 strokes, in which case, so it looks almost like this is the letter P here that we saw that was in the first, or in the Lipstick Killer's P's, where the bowl of the P consumed almost the entire portion of the stem, just leaving it slightly out there. And then we have the third stroke, which is the arcaded right leg. And of course, we see that the left leg, again, is much shorter than the right leg, hanging down. And then we actually have what I referred to just a few minutes ago is that drooping leg, that leg that shoots straight down instead of outward to the right, like a typical R should have. Many of the letter R's, I mean, obviously attempting to make this a disguised handwriting, were written with 3 strokes. That's just not reality. People don't typically write that way. It takes longer to do so. So in an effort of efficiency and speed, people will combine that into 2 or even 1 stroke to create the letter R. So we do know that this is very much a disguised handwriting for the lipstick killer. Moving over into Elizabeth Short, we do have some consistencies with the shapes of the letter R's, the drooping leg that comes straight down instead of outward to the right, the slants that we talked about between the left and right leg. And then of course the actual shape of the letter R's are very, very consistent. I mean, I didn't plan to drop this R down underneath Jack's. It just so happened to have occurred that way. And it rather, it doesn't shock me, obviously, but to have it fall where it fell and then have it be such a relatively similar shape in the length of the actual bowl, the shape of the exit stroke on the right leg, all of that being consistent. These letter R's in the Elizabeth Short case were very similar in structure to the Sorry Mary letter. So again, the only difference I saw there is that he attempted to flare out a concaved right leg, which we saw that Jack is very well astute at doing. And then of course we see that slant again between the left and right legs that occur. And we also mapped out a slant of the letter R that is leaning rightward. And we're going to see that that's very consistent with the crime scene notes. So just blasting through here really quickly, the Oswald letter had the drooping leg that came straight down. Sherry Jo Bates has a leg that actually protrudes at a level or an angle that is consistent with Jack's as it exits out of the R. There are consistencies, obviously, with, let's see here. That was the buckle and exit. Why did I mark that one? Consistent with. All right. Okay, so the Sherry Jo Bates actually had consistencies in the actual buckles with what we saw in the Zodiac Killers. That buckle being consistent as well with something that Jack does, where he doesn't touch all the way back to the stem. We'll come across it as we keep going. We also have this very elongated right leg that comes down. That's very consistent with D.B. Cooper, as we see over here. Very consistent with the Red Phantom. The Dear Draft Board letters, again, these have consistencies not only with Jack's writing, but also with other R's that are found within the red circles. As you go through, it could be the buckle and the actual bottom portion that are consistent, while the top portion is a little bit different. Again, you have to keep in mind that you never write the same way twice. So we're not going to be as lucky as we were up here with Elizabeth Short and Jack's writing to find something so darn consistent that almost all areas match. So we're looking to see if there are consistencies or characteristics in the way that any portion of these letters line up to determine whether or not they are consistent with the writing of Jack or the Zodiac. Moving into the Zodiac Killer, again, we find these very perfect R's, but then we run into these ones that are more consistent with what we're seeing up here in Jack's writing. I did map all of those out as something that was consistent with his. We did find, again, these square-shaped R's in the Zodiac writing, which was consistent with square-shaped R's in the D.B. Cooper. I believe I found this one. Gosh, if it wasn't too much to put lines from one to the next so that we could easily find them, I would, but I believe it would just block up too much of our views. Let me see. Here's another one of Jack's R's found right here in the Albany letter. More of Jack's R's found in the D.B. Cooper, from the melted over bowl to the actual same style, shape, and exit that we see. DB Cooper, again, we have another one that is consistent with Jack's writing. In fact, shape, I should have circled it up here. It did not get circled, but it's right here on the far right-hand side is consistent. Both the angle of the right leg that comes out, the angle of the left and right leg in relation to each other, that melted over bull once again, and then on into Albany. Again, we see that same similar shape that we were talking about up here in Jack's handwriting. Okay, we got about 5 minutes here. And to keep on going with that right leg, obviously, that is much longer than the rest of the letter R. We saw that consistent in Sherry Jo Bates. We saw it happening in JonBenet Ramsey. We saw it happening in, let's see, it was DB Cooper. We see it definitely happening in Jack's, but his tends to go to the right rather than downward. But it was also happening in the Atlanta, Georgia Killer. We see it happening in Tom Voight's right there. That curvature I showed or noted in Jack's actual writing in the Bruce Ivans. We had a consistency with the exit stroke that we see happening in Jack's with the Winovich. So, and then one of the things that I noted was obviously this crazy right leg that's put way out on the outside of the bowl of the R. This was something that was looked at when we were looking at the letter K's with the Zodiac, where his facade was to place the leg of the K so far out on the right arm of the letter K that and in a third stroke. So basically it looks like the letter P was made here, and then this final stroke was added after the fact way out on the outside of the bowl, which gave it kind of this weird base, if you will, for the letter R. But I did find that that base was consistent. Let's see, it was consistent with the Zodiac Killer right here. We found it. And then it was also consistent with Elizabeth Short, where he placed again, the leg far out on the outside of the actual bowl. Again, here in the Sorry Mary, we can see how wide that is because of where that actual leg is placed. Definitely just another consistency. We see it here in the Tim Miller. There again, although this is a single stroke that is occurring, but we still see it happening far off to the right-hand side of the bowl, which is definitely consistent with the anthrax letters. We are at 7:47. I don't have a lot to say about this particular one. You guys can sit here and go through this on your own if you want to pause and check it out. So I'm just going to do a quick run through. We see that the actual protruding stem of the letter R is here. As you go down, I have marked all of those with arrows. You can see that it's happening over and over again in these crime communications, which kind of tells me that once again, we are dealing with the same author. Another thing that we picked out of here is not only the shape, but that check mark R that they kept looking for in somebody's handwriting. That is definitely found throughout Jack's handwriting, including this flat, not so much elevated overhang of the R, but this flat wavy one that comes out. We'll start to see those. Also the overhang that has this angular tip we see, and also this loop in the stem. So it's a single stroke that is written with a loop in it. And that was one of the first things that triggered me in the Lipstick Killer cases, that Jack makes this loop in his R, and we see the loop in the R's that are found in the lipstick killing case. And we also find that the overhang actually elevates to the degree that occurs in Jack's handwriting. So we can see how high up that goes right there. But so if we just keep on moving through, again, we find the stems that are protruding and sticking up there. We found that occurring in, let's see, now here's the angular in Sherry Jo Bates that we were just talking about in Jack's. Here's the checkmark R in Sherry Jo Bates that is found in the Zodiac Killer and in Jack's handwriting. 1 minute. As we go down, we're going to continue to see these looped R's. We're going to see the overhangs that are similar with either Jack or other constructions that are found within these letters. And all the way through. So even all the way down to JonBenet Ramsey, I find is consistent with the Christmas card, consistent with the Sacramento letter from the Zodiac, on and on. Again, we found the angular overhang and the consistency in these particular letter R's with Jacks. So that is the lowercase r. We have now established that not only does Jack have the check mark, we see that the Sherry Joe Bates has the check mark. It is found definitely in the Zodiac Killer writings, and all the way down to, let's see if we can find some more just before we let everybody go. No, but in Voinovich, we again found that letter R with that tall stem that's sticking out the top. So with that, you guys, I'm going to let you go. We will return next week with the letter S. I thought we'd make it through that today, but obviously that took a little more time. So everybody have a wonderful weekend, and we'll see you next Friday. Oh,